Well, welcome to this event, a launch and a conversation here from the Centre of Baptist Studies at Regent's Park College in Oxford. My name is Andy Goodliffe. I am the Deputy Director of the Centre for Baptist Studies and also teach Baptist history here at Regent's Park College. And it's a delight to welcome you, as I say, to this launch and conversation for a new book that we're very, very pleased to publish. This new book, which you might already be aware of, is When I Am Among Friends, I Am Least Disabled, Friendship, Disability and Baptist Church Communities by the Reverend Dr. Martin Hobgen. And this afternoon, we're going to have a conversation with Martin and a couple of friends around this book. Martin will have an opportunity to explain a little bit why he wrote it. And then we're going to hear from two others who are going to be able to respond to having read it already. And then Martin will have an opportunity to pick up perhaps some of their comments and questions. And then if we've got time, we're going to continue the conversation a little bit further around this book. But our main desire is just to draw your attention to this wonderful new work from Martin. Martin is a Baptist minister, currently the minister of Swathling Baptist Church in Southampton, having completed his PhD at the University of Manchester. So, Martin, let me first of all welcome you.
Thank you.
And let me ask you the question. This book, When I Am Among Friends, I Am Least Disabled. Tell us a little bit of the story of why you've written this book.
Okay, thank you. Although I have been a lifelong wheelchair user, I've never really been involved in any disability groups or disability activism. And until I began training for Baptist ministry in the late 1990s, I had not even heard of disability theology. Soon after starting college, I read Nancy Iceland's seminal book, The Disabled God, which was published in 1994, a couple of years before I had read it. My eyes were open to a new way of understanding God, myself, and other disabled people. And so the exploration of disability theology became part of a theme running through my undergrad and then my MA studies. I gradually became aware of a very significant paradox between my own experiences of inclusion in church communities, communities that I was part of, and the reported, often anecdotal, exclusion and disempowerment of other disabled people from their church communities, or from any. So I began thinking about finding a way of pursuing research that could potentially make a difference to the participatory inclusion of disabled people, particularly those with physical disabilities, in the life of Baptist churches and others. And so my PhD was the outcome of that research. And the book is the result of quite a long struggle to get my research published. Book is an edited version of my PhD, and readers just need to be aware that there are some challenging parts that are essential to the academic background of the thesis. Some of the details are not essential for the proposal that friendships that are intentional, mutual, particular can foster the participatory inclusion of disabled people. The central argument should be accessible to all of those with a good grounding. Just one other comment, the title could have been extended to a rather cumbersome one of When I'm Among Friends, I'm Least Disabled, but when I'm among strangers, I am most disabled, emphasizing the difference that relationships between disabled and non-disabled can make to inclusion. Thank you, Andy.
Excellent. Thank you, Martin, for just giving us a little bit of a taste of what brought you to write this book. So I think we need to say congratulations on completing PhD. I know that was a few years ago now, but then congratulations on turning the PhD into a book. And our first respondent, David McLaughlin, will have a sense of the journey that takes sometimes himself to do. David is a Baptist minister. He is a member of the Baptist Union's Disability Justice Group. He's the author of Accessible Atonement, which is his own work in the area of disability theology, based on his own PhD, again, several years ago now. And David, it's great to welcome you and to hear your response to this book from Martin, When I Am Among Friends, I Am Least Disabled. David, over to you.
Okay, yes, you're right. The journey from doing the work to getting a book out is It's not necessarily a straightforward one. But I have to say, I was really keen to read Martin's book. Um, we've been friends and colleagues for quite some time, and I had dipped into bits of Martin's PhD from time to time. But this was the first time I really had the chance to, or the discipline, I suppose, to sit down and get the benefit of the full argument, which I have to say I really enjoyed. So I think just a few comments. One of the very clear features of the book is how rooted it is. It has very firm roots in the realities of Baptist church life, and which can be a bit gritty at times, and Martin's own experiences. So his wider life, his life within churches, and what I think is really important, going through the settlement process, becoming a minister himself, because it gives the discussion a really kind of practical sounding board. It avoids it drifting off into generalities about churches in general or experiences in general, which is always a bit of a risk with theological work. Um, and we don't have general experiences. You know, we have our own specific ones, and we want to bounce ideas off those. So I think that's an important part of reading the book and what comes out of it. So in the book itself, Martin lays out his groundwork very thoroughly, which is actually pretty easy to follow. Now, I'm a great lover of words and the way that language works. So, as a preacher, I'm really interested in how words carry ideas, or sometimes fail to carry ideas. So I really enjoyed the exploration that you find in the book of metaphor and the presumptions that get smuggled into our discussions by the words that we use. So there was discussion about how we use words like walk and see and hear, and what we mean by those, the kind of meaning we intend them to carry. Now, I've been aware of that sort of thing, having looked at it myself from time to time. So, our habits of language, but it's good to have a focused discussion of that. Um, Within it, I was particularly struck, one thing I'd like to just comment on, by the work Martin has done on the seemingly simple word disabled, and how when you sort of break it down and look at dis, how dis is used as a prefix in lots of ways to say something negative. So we might have disused or disbanded or dishonorable or disintegrated. And then on the other hand, how able is used as a suffix to mean something positive. So let's say usable, portable, understandable. So disabled, once we start to think about it, is actually bringing in a great big burden of negative meaning often that's not generally being examined. And I think thinking deeply about that is really helpful. So I think that's a great contribution. Now, the other area of the groundwork where, if you like, the heavy lifting gets done is around the Trinity. So Martin uses the work by Paul Fides in particular, which is also well worth a read if anyone wants to explore that. As I say, this is where the hard work gets done, and it's carefully examining the nature of God's relationships within Himself, within the Trinity, and crucially, what we can legitimately, not just superficially, but seriously transpose into a human context, and particularly relationships where there can be a serious power imbalance. And that's the kind of thing that's being explored here. Now, this bit, as Martin hinted, it does take a bit of effort to read. It's not that hard to read, but it takes a bit of effort, but the effort is well rewarded. So it's worth sticking with it. Towards the end of that section, one thing I just wanted to draw out, which I think is worthy of attention, which is really to do with pastoral implications, is Martin spends a bit of time on the struggle that faces us if we want to avoid imposing or assuming particular roles for disabled and non-disabled people. So, for instance, there's the what he calls the sick role for the disabled person, and so on. And that has serious implications for disabled people and churches in general when we start to talk about leadership positions and that kind of thing. So I think there's something really important to think about there. Last comment is that in the end, I would say that for me, the real triumph of the book is that Martin draws out something from all of that work. He draws out something that's extremely practical for churches to work on. And it's this idea of friendships that are three things: intentional, mutual, and particular. And they emerge directly out of all that work, this sort of foundational theological and linguistic work. But they're really easy to pick up and to start working with. They almost form like a manifesto, really worthy of attention in our churches, and something that can be, I think, discussed without everybody having delved into the depths of the theological discussion. So really useful. I've got a couple of sort of follow-on questions, but I think we might deal with those when we come to the discussion part of our time together. So that's I'll leave it there if that's okay.
David, thank you for response and highlighting many of the things that I appreciated about the book as well. It's grounded in Martin's story and experience, but also the experience of others. His attention to language and this attention to how we can bring theology into kind of context of practice and church. So having heard from David, we're also now going to hear from Ellie Ovens, who is a disability rights advocate and educator. She is also a member of the Baptist Union's Disability Justice Group, but she's about to begin ministry and training at Luther King Theological College. And so it'd be very fascinating to hear how you responded to the book, reading some of Martin's own experiences and his argument that he makes. Ellie, it'd be lovely to hear your response to Martin's book.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, the first thing I need to say, sorry. So part of my disability impacts my vocal cords. So that's why I'm clearing them. It's fine. So the first thing I need to say is I need to say a massive thank you to Martin for writing this book. I have read many theological books over the years, and some of them are really good in the realm of disability. Some of them are really good in the realm of theology. Lots of theological books either brush over or completely ignore the implications of disability into theological and ecumenical life and what it means to be part of forgiveness and the Trinity and community as a disabled person. And so for Martin to find that balance of theology and lived experience is really unusual. I've had times where I've read books and I've actually felt like an outsider. You read it and you think, I can see this as an observer, but I feel like I'm looking through a window because I don't live the experience of the person who's writing this book. And it's clear that they have no understanding of just how different life is when you become a disabled person or if you've always been a disabled person. And so finding that balance was really exciting. There was moments of reading Martin's book where I was actually breathtaken by just how similar some experiences Martin had been through were to my own. And at some points that was positive and hopeful, and at other points it was really overwhelmingly upsetting to know that the negative experiences I had had, which I had hoped to have been individualistic, were actually far more universal amongst disabled people in churches. And as a disabled Christian, as someone I was born with my health conditions, but I became a wheelchair user in my 20s. I have walked the journey of disability with my church community and seen just how hard it is for them to come to terms with my disability. And there is not enough narrative on that, on how your community, how friendships in particular can support someone who is disabled, whether that is that they're disabled at the point you've met them or disabled during your friendship. And so, yeah, that just completely overwhelmed me that someone else could understand that experience as I did. And I could see how they'd progressed through that, not just theoretically, but in community and in experience as well, which was fantastic to read about. I'm going to specifically pick up on Martin's discussion of the dance, the divine dance rather, and the fact that, as Martin said, while some wheelchair users do dance and they dance professionally, actually dancing is quite often a very exclusionary act for people who are seated, especially if that dance is held in a circle, which is often how we see the divine dance depicted. It's as three people holding hands in a circle. And that's something that I can't participate in. And so to not only hear the theological understanding around the divine dance, around how we can understand the divine dance, but also to actually acknowledge that exclusion is really game changing. To acknowledge that there is a different perspective, and that also the perspective that Martin was taking while writing the book is not the perspective of everyone, but that in the change of the divine dance into a progressive dance rather than a cyclical one, actually that can be adapted to include anybody. Even as a wheelchair user, I can dance with someone without moving at all if they're willing to come and join me rather than me be expected to come and join them. And I think that's such an illustration of what Martin's talking about in this book. And it gives me such hope that, as David said, this book not only explains where the hard parts, where the sticking points currently are, but also how we move past them. How do we bring hope to a community who has been left without hope quite frequently in church environments? How do we empower those who want to bring people into their communities? How do we empower them to do that? And Martin really beautifully outlines how friendship and how seeking true friendship rather than just pastoral support makes that difference, and how that can just change the narrative around someone's experience of church and experience of faith. And I think that's absolutely spectacular. And there are so many people I would love to read this book, just because I think if you don't have a lived experience of this, it's a book to read. If you do have a lived experience of this, it's a book to read. As Andy said, I'm currently in the very final stages of going through the interview process to start training for Baptist ministry come September. And this book and conversations that I've had with Martin have felt so relieving. They've reduced the anxiety I felt. They've explained to me what I can expect. One of the first conversations I had with Martin after deciding I was doing this in the first call, once we'd done the kind of mutual hello, was, Martin, how do you as a wheelchair user baptize someone? Because that was one of my biggest anxieties. And this book reaches into that place of, I'm a disabled person, how do I do this? And not only guides you, but then grounds it in theological understanding that this is what it means to be community. This is what it means to have friendship. And this is how everyone can be brought into that progressive dance. So I just think it's a wonderful book. Like David, I have some questions to ask Martin, but I think I'm going to leave it there for a minute and we can come back. But yeah, once again, thank you, Martin, for the book, and also for your friendship, because it has definitely made a massive difference to me, my faith, and my journey into ministry.
Thank you, Ellie, and thank you, David, again for those two responses to the book. They join the responses of Professor Paul Fiddes, the Professor John Swinton, and Dr. Sally Nelson on the back of the book, all commending it to us to read. Let me just make one final quick comment about the book, which I think is also another one of its strengths, is if you want an introduction into how disability studies have thought through the many questions around it, Martin's book does that. If you want an introduction to disability theology, Martin's book does that. If you want an introduction to Paul Fiddes' understanding of the doctrine of the Trinity, Martin Books does that. And so I think, again, for those of us who don't have obvious disabilities, and we're perhaps not engaged or aware of the conversations that have been taking place over many decades now, Martin's book is a way of actually us understanding what disability studies and disability theology has been doing for many times, and helped us get up to speed, perhaps, and engage with these conversations in a very Baptist context. I think, again, that is another strength of the book, is it's rooted in its Baptist context. And I hope one of the things that will come out of this book is that there will be more Baptist theological reflection around the place of disability and the place of people with disabilities in our churches. So we've all commended it. But there are some things I think the book raises some questions and that's one thing that theology does and books do. They raise questions for us to think further or to try and think around what is being said. So David, if you want to ask your questions, then Ellie, yours. And then if you're able to, perhaps, David and Ellie, to copy your questions if they're on a computer and put them into the chat. There we can hold them in our heads as Martin kind of responds to them. So David, what are your questions or comments that you want to ask Martin, having read the book?
Okay, I'll ask the questions, and then while Ellie's doing that, I'll do battle with the tech and see if I can get the questions into the chat, which I'm sure will work okay. So Martin, I think if someone was reading the book, I think one of the kind of really important ideas, but which is, I think, maybe a theological ideas, but which I think might be worth just talking around a bit, is Paul Fiddes' idea of persons as relations, because it's an important idea, but it's not necessarily the most immediately obvious idea. So I just thought, because it's really important in the way that his understanding of relationships, divine and human, if you could just give us a brief sketch of why that is such an important idea here. So I think that'd be really good. My second thing is around the whole business of friendships that are intentional, mutual, and particular. I know most of your work is in the context of people with physical disabilities, which you've said very clearly. I did wonder if you had any thoughts about how these ideas might work in situations of intellectual disabilities, where there seems to be so much power in lying in the hands of the non-disabled person, or at least on the face of it, that's how it looks. And then the last point is a Baptist point. Being a Baptist minister, I'd have to ask one of these, which is really, do you think there's something that Baptist congregations in particular have in the way that, in terms of practice and the way that we do church? Is there something that Baptist ecclesiology has to offer the wider church when it comes to the participatory inclusion of disabled people? So those are my three questions. I'll shut up now, and I'll wrestle with the tech and let Ellie speak about hers.
Thanks, David. So I also have a couple of questions. Mine come from a slightly more kind of disability lived experience angle. So the first one is, what in your research gives you hope for the future of disability inclusion within Baptist churches specifically, but also the wider Christian community? As David said, how do we expand that? And is there anything specific about Baptist churches that gives us hope for the future? My second question is, your book looks at how friendship can enable equality and participation within churches. What role do you believe that friendship has in rebuilding the damaged relationships that there currently is between churches and people with disabilities? And my final question for you is, as a disabled person myself, I have struggled with my own internalized ableism and with my own anxieties. And my friendship with you and with David has helped me overcome this during my discernment journey. What would you like to say to someone with a disability or who struggles with an impairment, who feels they are not good enough to participate in church or in faith leadership? Those are my questions. So I will paste those into the chat now.
Okay, thank you. One question that Ellie actually posed me that she didn't mention was what was the original the idea of the audience of the book, which I will respond to because it partly ties in with the nature of the book and my original intentions and my current intentions. The purpose of the research, as I've already said, was to try and find a way of making a real difference, excuse me, to the way disabled people are fully included in Baptist church communities. So the intended audience is really ministers and church leaders. However, in contrast to David, who completely rewrote his PhD, I suffered with quite severe writer's block after I'd finished my thesis. And so it isn't a complete rewrite. And therefore, the intended audience, although it is the same, there are some caveats. And I'm quite encouraged by things, particularly David said, that those caveats, that it is significantly theological and academic, don't hinder the core messages, the important things that I've been arguing that come through. I'm very grateful to Regent's Park for and Andy for all his hard work as well in enabling this version to come out. And regarding a wider audience, I'm currently waiting to hear back from Grove Booklets. I've submitted a proposal for a short, non-technical and far more accessible, certainly in my opinion, version of the proposal for friendship, fostering participatory inclusion. David asked about this phrase, persons as relations. Throughout my thesis, it's got as in italics to contrast it with persons in relation. One of the encouraging developments within wider disability studies over the last probably 30 years has been the shift away from a focus on individuals and their what are described as impairments, used to be described as handicaps, and maybe their medical conditions, and a focus away from that towards a greater acknowledgement of the impact of attitudes and actions of societies or organizations or communities, and therefore the impact on non-disabled people and their attitudes and actions towards disabled people. Churches in general, and I hate making such sweeping statements, have been much slower in understanding this change of focus. And significant parts of the church have tended to focus on individuals, their disabilities, their impairments, their medical conditions. And this is where Paul Fiddis's Trinitarian theology is fundamental to what I'm seeking to do. The concept of persons as relation places the focus on the relations within the Trinity. In fact, Paul argues that the persons of the Trinity are persons as relationship rather than individuals in relationship. That's quite a complicated thing to get your head around. But it places the focus on rather than on the characteristics of the three persons in the Trinity, to the relationships within them and this dynamic nature which has been described as a dance, as the metaphor of the dance. So the relations of Father, Son, Son, Spirit, and Father, Spirit. And so by analogy, the theological focus is shifted away from, for instance, to what extent are disabled people made in the image of God, and focuses attention on the relationships between disabled and non-disabled people and with God. This understanding of Trinity also suggests that God enables and encourages us to participate in the life of the Godhead, working together in the world in covenant relationship, seeking to include all who God includes in the kingdom of God, and therefore getting rid of the barriers that the social and identity barriers that we tend to erect between different groups. So by analogy, I've argued that friendships which are intentionally inclusive, explicitly mutual, and take into account the particularity of friendships in their context are the best way, a good way of fostering participatory inclusion of disabled people in church communities. Just a thought. I emphasize participatory inclusion rather than just inclusion, because the experience of many disabled people is that they are welcomed to attend church and to sit in the pew, or as a wheelchair user, beside the pew, but to actually be involved in the engagement in leadership or fuller participation within the community often doesn't happen. David also asked how such friendships relate to people with intellectual disabilities. The short answer is that I drew the idea of friendships between disabled and non-disabled people from the work of others within the theological body thinking about people with intellectual or learning disabilities through large communities and similar groups working with people with learning disabilities. The language of companion is used rather than that of carer and cared for to describe the relationships within such communities. The longer answer is that friendship has been an important part of the theological reflections on the nature and the inclusion of people with learning disabilities, including significant work by Stanley Hauerwas, Henri Nouwen, Hans Reinders, and others. I discovered that friendship had largely been overlooked both by sociologists in the wider disability studies field and by theologians with regards to people with physical disabilities. And as I was listening to, I think it was David commenting about general and particular, I think that overlooking of the nature of relationships is because there has been an assumption that the nature of friendships or the nature of relationships between people, disabled and non-disabled people, is the same as other forms of friendship. There is some evidence that that is not the case. And the particular nature of those relationships has not been reflected upon or explored. So I drew on the work of Hans Reinders in his book, Receiving the Gift of Friendship, to develop my model. These friendships are extrinsically rooted in God's offer of friendship with humanity through Jesus Christ, rather than intrinsically within ourselves in individual characteristics, or even human friendships, which, as we can be very aware, can be highly distorted and manipulative. But we do need to remember that there has been and often remains a significant power imbalance between disabled people with learning disabilities and with physical disabilities and non-disabled people. And that's been shown in the research by Jacobs in her book At the Gates. If you look in the book, if you buy the book, you will be able to find Jacobs' research on the pastoral relationship with disabled people. Both Ellie and David have asked about the Baptist context of my proposal. The ecclesiology of Baptist churches is highly relational rather than structural or hierarchical. We understand that relationship in terms of covenant relationship with God and with fellow believers, and we use the language of walking together and watching over one another, which, as well, I've explored the nature of those metaphors. And I suggest that the covenant relationships can be thought of in terms of friendships, and in practical terms, these can be significant in the participatory inclusion of disabled people. The expressions of walking together and watching over one another are suggestive of the sort of activities that friends participate in together and encourage one another to participate together. We have to ensure that these are understood metaphorically, not literally. Occasionally, I get picked up, and if I say I go for a walk with my wife, people go, "No, you don't. You wheel with your wife," as an example of how those can be understood wrongly. Because sometimes, if you take them with the wrong meaning, as Elias inferred, they can be seen as excluding people. Baptist ecclesiology context for such covenantal friendships is one of the aspects of my research that gives me hope for the future of the inclusion of disabled people in Baptist communities and wider. Ellie asked me, this was the question I think I struggled with a bit, what I would say to disabled people who feel they're not good enough to participate in church or faith leadership. I remember being told at the age of 16 by an occupational therapist who was involved in helping me gain my independence that they thought I would, quotes, "Get yourself up in time to cook yourself a meal in time to get yourself to bed." When asked what they thought of my hopes of going to university, they said it was a pipe dream. 4 degrees later. There's been a very long history of disabled people being the subject of intentional and unintentional disempowering in many different ways. However, that's not how God sees us. And I think this is the answer in many ways to Ellie's question. Because I very, very clearly remember reading Psalm 139 for the first time a few months after becoming a Christian just over 40 years ago. Verses 13 to 18 had a very, very profound effect on me, because if God thought I was, quotes, fearfully and wonderfully made, and that, quotes, all the days ordained for me were written in your book, then it mattered far less what other people thought of me. It mattered far more about my relationship with God. And that's enabled me to repeatedly refute the common assumption that God would need to heal me physically before he used me. My worth, in common with all of us, is not grounded in whether I can walk or talk or see, etc., or my academic abilities, but in my relationship with the triune God. Thank you. Thank you for your questions. And I hope that sparks at least a little bit of debate.
Martin, thank you for those responses to some great questions from Ellie and David, which hopefully, again, will whet the appetite for many to go away and get the book themselves. Again, here's the front cover. Let me encourage you to get it. It's available on Amazon, both as a print book that you can order, but also as an ebook. And we've tried to make it very reasonably priced so that it isn't inhibitive from those getting a copy and reading it. I think this is such an important piece of work. Again, Baptism engaged in thinking about, well, not thinking perhaps, about working with people with disabilities since the kind of early 80s and mid 80s. And here we pay testament to the work of Faith Bowers. But what I think is exciting about Martin's work, and perhaps it will be something that will begin something, is Martin is not just thinking practically about issues of disability, but theologically. And he does that as a person with disabilities themselves. Whereas perhaps the conversation began about people with disabilities. Now there's this, with Martin's work and with others, this is a fully participating, inclusive conversation that is going on, and may that continue in so many ways. So Martin, congratulations again from us for getting the book to this place. We hope it's widely read.